The gunshot still rang in his ears long after his wife had been laid to rest. Xavier Grayson stood beside the freshly dug grave, his two children clutching his hands as the unforgiving Kansas wind whipped across the prairie. In that moment, he made a solemn vow that somehow he would find a way to raise Emma and James alone, even if it killed him. Kansas Territory, 1869, the setting sun cast long shadows across the weathered porch of the Grayson homestead, 3 miles outside of Hays City, Kansas. Xavier Grayson, 34 years old and worn beyond his years, lowered himself into the creaking rocking chair, his tired bones protesting after a long day of work. His calloused hands fumbled with tobacco as he rolled a cigarette, his eyes drifting to the horizon where the golden plains met the endless sky. 2 years had passed since typhoid had taken Martha, leaving him with 8-year-old Emma and 6-year-old James. 2 years of struggling to keep the small cattle ranch afloat while trying to be both mother and father to children who barely spoke anymore, let alone smiled. "Pa," Emma's small voice came from the doorway behind him. "Supper's ready." Xavier nodded, taking one last drag before extinguishing the cigarette. "Be right there, darlin'." Inside, the cabin was tidy but sparse. Emma had set the table with their mismatched plates. James sat silently, his eyes downcast as always. The boy hadn't spoken more than necessary since his mother's death, withdrawing further with each passing season. "Looks good," Xavier said, eyeing the simple meal of beans and cornbread that Emma had prepared. They ate in silence, the only sounds the scraping of forks against plates and the occasional howl of a distant coyote. Xavier tried, as he did most nights, to draw his children into conversation. "Saw some new foals at the Thompson place today," he offered. "Thought maybe we could ride over there someday soon. Might be nice to get out." Emma nodded politely. James didn't respond at all. Later, after the children had gone to bed, Xavier sat at the kitchen table with a ledger open before him, tallying figures that never seemed to add up favorably. Winter was approaching, and the ranch needed repairs before the snows came. He needed more hands to help with the cattle, but couldn't afford to hire anyone. Running a hand through his dark hair, now streaked with premature silver, he sighed. Something had to change. The following morning, Xavier rode into Hays City. The town had grown considerably since the Kansas Pacific Railway had come through, bringing both commerce and trouble in equal measure. He tethered his horse outside of Hollister's general store and made his way inside. "Morning, Xavier," greeted Samuel Hollister, the rotund shopkeeper. "What brings you in today?" "Need some supplies," Xavier replied, handing over his short list. "And wondering if you'd heard of anyone looking for work, could use an extra pair of hands at the ranch." Samuel stroked his gray beard thoughtfully. "Most able bodies are working the railroad these days. Pays better than ranching, I'm afraid." He paused, sorting through Xavier's requested items. "Though I did hear something that might interest you." "Stage came through yesterday carrying a woman headed to Fort Hays. Seems she's some kind of teacher or governess. Might be worth talking to her if you're looking for help with those youngsters of yours." Xavier frowned. "Don't need a governess, need a ranch hand." "Way I hear it, those children of yours haven't been to school in months. Sheriff mentioned it to me the other day." Xavier's jaw tightened. "I've been teaching them myself, just been busy with the ranch is all." "No judgment from me," Samuel said, raising his palms. "Just passing along information. The lady's staying at Mrs. Palmer's boarding house if you're interested." Xavier paid for his supplies, his mind turning over the shopkeeper's words. It was true the children's education had suffered. Emma tried to keep up with her reading, but he'd had precious little time to help either of them with their studies. Martha had been the one who'd sat with them each evening, patiently going through their lessons. After collecting his other supplies and conducting his business at the bank, a discouraging meeting that left him with few options for making it through the winter, Xavier found himself standing outside Mrs. Palmer's boarding house. The 2-story clapboard building with its neat white trim stood in stark contrast to the rougher establishments further down the street. Hesitating at the door, Xavier removed his hat and ran a hand through his hair before knocking. A moment later, the door swung open to reveal Mrs. Palmer herself, a stern-faced widow whose demeanor had only hardened since her husband's passing 10 years prior. "Mr. Grayson," she said, surprise evident in her tone. "What brings you here? Heard you've got a new boarder." "A teacher?" Mrs. Palmer's eyes narrowed slightly. "Miss Abigail James arrived yesterday. She's to work at Fort Hays, teaching the officers' children." "Might I speak with her? She's taking tea in the parlor. I suppose it wouldn't hurt to introduce you." Mrs. Palmer gestured for him to follow her inside. The parlor was a tidy room furnished with delicate pieces that seemed at odds with the frontier town outside. Seated by the window, a young woman looked up from her book as they entered. Xavier was struck immediately by her appearance, not conventionally beautiful perhaps, but striking, with intelligent hazel eyes that assessed him quickly. "Miss James, this is Mr. Xavier Grayson. He owns a cattle ranch outside of town and wishes to speak with you." Abigail James set her book aside and rose to greet him. She was tall for a woman, though still a head shorter than Xavier's considerable height. Her chestnut hair was pulled back in a simple knot, and her dress, while well made, was practical rather than fashionable. "How do you do, Mr. Grayson?" she asked, her voice carrying an Eastern accent that immediately marked her as an outsider. "Madam," Xavier nodded, "I understand you're a teacher." "Yes, I've been hired to teach at the fort, Mrs. Palmer excused herself, leaving them alone in the parlor, though Xavier noticed she left the door conspicuously ajar. "What can I do for you, Mr. Grayson?" Abigail asked, gesturing for him to take a seat opposite her. Xavier remained standing, turning his hat in his hands. "I've got 2 children, madam, 8 and 6. Their mother passed 2 years ago. They're falling behind in their studies, and I thought perhaps, well, I wondered if you might consider taking on additional pupils." Abigail's expression softened slightly. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Grayson. As for teaching your children, I'm afraid my contract with the fort is quite specific. I'm to live there and teach daily." Xavier nodded, already turning to leave. "Of course, just thought I'd ask. However," she continued, causing him to pause, "my duties don't begin for another week. The commanding officer's family hasn't arrived yet. I suppose I could call on your children for a few days to assess their educational needs and perhaps provide you with some guidance for continuing their studies." Hope flickered briefly within him. "That would be most kind, Miss James. I should warn you I charge for my services, $1 per day plus transportation to and from your ranch." Xavier hesitated. $1 a day was steep, but he could manage it for a few days if it meant getting the children back on track. "That's acceptable. When could you start?" "Tomorrow, if you'd be so kind as to arrange transportation." "I'll come for you myself." 8 o'clock, Abigail nodded. 8 o'clock it is, Mr. Grayson." As Xavier rode home, his mind was occupied with thoughts of the forthright young teacher. There was something about her, a quiet strength that reminded him of Martha, though the 2 women couldn't have been more different otherwise. Martha had been a frontier woman through and through, born and raised in Kansas territory. This Miss James was clearly an Easterner, probably from one of those fancy women's colleges he'd heard about. When he returned home, he found Emma attempting to patch one of James's shirts, her small fingers struggling with the needle. "Got someone coming tomorrow," he announced as he set his purchases on the table. "A teacher, going to help get you both caught up on your studies." Emma looked up, surprise flickering across her face. "A teacher coming here just for a few days. She'll be working at the fort after that." James, who had been whittling a piece of wood by the fireplace, didn't acknowledge the news, though Xavier noticed his son's hands had stilled. "I want you both on your best behavior," Xavier continued. "And Emma, see if you can find those books your mother used for your lessons." That evening, Xavier found himself cleaning the cabin more thoroughly than usual, sweeping the floors and clearing away the clutter that had accumulated. He even took down the dusty curtains Martha had sewn and washed them in the creek, hanging them to dry overnight. Morning came with a clear sky and the promise of a warm autumn day. Xavier dressed in his least worn shirt, combed his hair, and trimmed his beard before waking the children. "Want you both washed and dressed proper," he instructed as Emma helped James with his clothes. "Teacher will be here soon." The ride to town was quiet, Xavier rehearsing what he would say to Miss James. He wasn't good with words, never had been. Martha had teased him about his taciturn nature, drawing him out of his shell with her gentle persistence. Since her death, he'd retreated further into silence, speaking only when necessary. At precisely 8 o'clock, Xavier stood outside Mrs. Palmer's boarding house. Miss James emerged promptly, dressed in a sensible traveling outfit and carrying a small case. "Good morning, Mr. Grayson," she greeted him, Miss James. He helped her onto the wagon, noting that she climbed up with practiced ease despite her city upbringing. "It's about 3 miles to the ranch." As they traveled, Abigail attempted conversation. "How long have you lived in Kansas, Mr. Grayson? Born here. My father came out with the first settlers in '54. During the border troubles." Xavier glanced at her, surprised by her knowledge. "Yes, lost him in '56 to Quantrill's raiders." "I'm sorry to hear that." "The conflict over slavery claimed many lives." She paused, then added, "I'm from Massachusetts myself. My father was an abolitionist." Xavier nodded but offered no further comment. Politics was dangerous territory, even 4 years after the war's end. "And your children?" She prompted when the silence stretched too long. "Tell me about them." "Emma's 8, smart girl, likes reading when she can get books. James is 6, quiet. Both of them were different before their mother died." "Grief affects children profoundly," Abigail said softly. "Sometimes more than adults realize." They arrived at the ranch to find Emma and James waiting on the porch, unusually tidy and solemn. Xavier helped Abigail down from the wagon and led her to the house. "Children, this is Miss James. She'll be teaching you for the next few days." Abigail smiled warmly. "Hello, Emma, James. I'm very pleased to meet you both." Emma curtsied awkwardly. "Hello, madam." James merely nodded, eyes fixed on his boots. "I need to tend to the cattle," Xavier said. "You'll be all right here." "We'll be fine, Mr. Grayson," Abigail assured him. "Perhaps we could use the kitchen table for our lessons." Xavier spent the morning mending fences in the south pasture, but found his attention repeatedly drawn to the house. Through the window, he could see Abigail sitting between his children, her head bent close to theirs as she guided them through their lessons. At midday, he returned to the house for dinner. Abigail had helped Emma prepare a simple meal, and the 4 of them sat down together. "How are they doing?" Xavier asked after an awkward silence. "Quite well," Abigail replied. "Emma reads beautifully, and James has a natural aptitude for mathematics." James ducked his head at the praise, but Xavier thought he detected a hint of pleasure in his son's expression. "After we eat, I thought we might have a music lesson," Abigail continued. "I brought my auto harp. Music is an essential part of a well-rounded education." "Don't know that they need music to run a ranch," Xavier said dubiously. Abigail's eyes met his across the table, unflinching. "Education isn't solely about practical skills, Mr. Grayson. It's about enriching the mind and spirit." He had no response to that. After the meal, Xavier returned to his work, but found himself lingering closer to the house than necessary. Through the open window, he could hear Abigail's clear voice as she taught the children a simple song. To his surprise, he heard Emma's voice join in, hesitant at first, then with growing confidence. That evening, after Abigail had departed for town with a promise to return the following day, Xavier sat with the children as they ate supper. "Did you like your lessons?" he asked. "Miss James is nice," Emma ventured. "She doesn't get cross when I make mistakes." Xavier nodded, relieved to hear his daughter speaking more than the bare minimum. "And you, James, what did you think?" The boy shrugged, but then quietly said, "She plays music pretty." It was the longest sentence James had spoken in months. Over the next few days, a routine developed. Xavier would collect Abigail from town each morning and return her each evening. During the day, she worked with the children on reading, writing, arithmetic, and music. To Xavier's amazement, his children began to emerge from their shells. Emma chattered more at mealtimes, eager to share what she'd learned. James remained quiet, but his silence seemed less oppressive, and occasionally he would answer a direct question with more than a nod or shrug. On the 4th day, Xavier returned from repairing the barn roof to find Abigail seated on a blanket under the large oak tree beside the house, reading to the children from a book of poetry. The scene struck him with unexpected force. How long had it been since his children had enjoyed such a simple pleasure? That night, After returning Abigail to town, Xavier found himself lingering in Hayes City, eventually making his way to the drover's saloon. It had been months since he'd had a drink or sought company other than his children's. He nursed a whiskey at the bar, listening to the piano player's cheerful tunes and the rowdy conversations around him. "Grayson, haven't seen you in here in an age." Thomas Reed, a neighboring rancher, clapped him on the shoulder. "How are things out your way?" Xavier shrugged. "Managing. Heard you hired that new schoolmarm to teach your youngsters." News traveled fast in Hayes City. Just for a few days, Reed ordered another round for them both. "Shame she's headed for the fort. Pretty little thing, ain't she? Educated, too." Xavier grunted noncommittally, though he couldn't deny Abigail James had a certain appeal. It wasn't just her appearance, though she was pleasing enough to look at with those intelligent eyes and the way her mouth curved when she smiled. It was something else, her certainty, perhaps, the way she moved through the world knowing her place in it. The next morning, Xavier arrived at Mrs. Palmer's to find Abigail waiting with her case and a larger bag. "I took the liberty of borrowing some books from the fort's library," she explained as he helped her into the wagon. "Since today is my last day with your children, I wanted to leave them with material to continue their studies." Xavier nodded, a twinge of regret surprising him. "They've taken to you. Haven't seen them this animated in a long time." Abigail smiled. "They're wonderful children, Mr. Grayson. You should be proud." "Their mother would be," he said quietly. As they drove, Abigail gazed out at the golden prairie grasses swaying in the breeze. "It's beautiful here," she remarked, "so vast and open, different from Massachusetts but beautiful in its own way." Xavier glanced at her. "Most Easterners find it desolate." "Perhaps they're not looking properly. There's life everywhere if you know how to see it." At the ranch, the day proceeded much like the others, though Xavier found himself inventing reasons to return to the house throughout the morning. At midday, he was surprised when Abigail suggested they eat outside. "It's such a lovely day," she said. "I thought a picnic might be nice for my last lesson with the children." So they spread a blanket beneath the oak tree again, and Emma proudly served the bread and cheese and apples she had prepared. Xavier sat awkwardly at first, unused to such leisurely meals, but gradually relaxed as Abigail engaged them all in conversation. "Have you always lived on this ranch, Mr. Grayson?" she asked. "Built it with Martha, my wife, after we married. Started with just the cabin and 20 head of cattle. And now, 150 head, not the biggest spread, but it's ours." He paused, correcting himself. "Mine and the children's now." After they'd eaten, Abigail took out her auto harp. "I thought we might have a proper music lesson outdoors today," she said, settling the instrument on her lap. As she began to play, Xavier was struck by the simple beauty of the melody. Her fingers moved confidently across the strings, and then she began to sing. Her voice was clear and true, filling the air with a sweetness that seemed to hover over the prairie like morning mist. The song was a folk ballad, one Xavier vaguely recognized from his own childhood, a tale of love and loss and finding home. As Abigail sang, Xavier noticed something extraordinary happening. Emma was smiling, her eyes bright as she watched Abigail's fingers on the strings. And James quiet, withdrawn. James was transfixed, his small face transformed by wonder. When the song ended, there was a moment of profound silence before Emma spoke. "That was beautiful, Miss James. Could you teach us to sing it?" "Of course," Abigail replied. "Would you like to learn too, Mr. Grayson?" Xavier shook his head quickly. Never had much of a singing voice. But he remained as Abigail patiently taught the children the lyrics, line by line, having them repeat after her until they could sing along. When Emma and James finally sang the entire song together, accompanied by Abigail's auto harp, Xavier felt something crack open inside him, a door he'd kept firmly shut since Martha's death. That evening, as they prepared for Xavier to take Abigail back to town, the children were unusually animated. Emma hugged Abigail impulsively, and even James offered his hand for a solemn handshake. "Thank you, Miss James," Emma said. "Will we see you again?" Abigail glanced at Xavier before answering. "Perhaps I'll be at the fort, which isn't so very far away." The ride back to town was quieter than usual, Xavier struggling to find the right words to express his gratitude. As they approached Hayes City, he finally spoke. "You've done more for my children in 5 days than I've managed in 2 years." Abigail turned to him, her expression gentle in the fading light. "You've kept them fed and safe and loved, Mr. Grayson. Don't diminish that achievement. Still, I'm grateful." He hesitated, then added, "If you ever have a free day from your duties at the fort, you'd be welcome at our table." "Thank you, I'd like that." At Mrs. Palmer's boarding house, Xavier helped Abigail down from the wagon and handed her the case and bag. Their hands brushed briefly, and he felt an unexpected jolt at the contact. "Good evening, Mr. Grayson," she said with a small smile. "And good luck with your children's education. The books I've left should keep them occupied for some time." "Good evening, Miss James." As he drove home, Xavier found himself humming the tune Abigail had taught the children. It had been years since he'd had a song in his head. The next few weeks brought changes to the Grayson household. Following Abigail's guidance, Xavier established a routine for the children's studies, setting aside time each evening to read with them or practice their sums. Emma flourished under the attention, while James slowly began to emerge from his shell, occasionally offering observations that revealed his keen mind. But it was music that truly transformed them. Xavier had discovered Abigail had left her autoharp for the children to practice with, along with simple sheet music. Each evening after supper, Emma would take out the instrument, and she and James would sing the songs Abigail had taught them. Their voices, thin and sweet, filled the cabin with a warmth that had been absent for too long. As October gave way to November, Xavier found his thoughts turning frequently to Abigail James. He wondered how she was faring at the fort, teaching the officers' children. Twice he considered riding out there on some pretext, but each time talked himself out of it. What would a refined, educated woman want with a widowed rancher barely keeping his head above water? Then one crisp Saturday in mid-November, as Xavier and the children were returning from a trip to Hayes City for supplies, they spotted a familiar figure walking along the road toward their ranch. "It's Miss James," Emma cried, bouncing on the wagon seat. "Pa, look, it's Miss James." Xavier pulled the wagon to a halt beside Abigail, who smiled up at them, her cheeks flushed from the walk and the cool air. "Good afternoon," she greeted them. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I have Saturdays free and I remembered your invitation. You walked all the way from the fort." Xavier asked, incredulous. Fort Hayes was at least 5 miles from their ranch. "I enjoy walking and it's a beautiful day," Abigail replied, "but I'd welcome a ride the rest of the way if you're offering." Xavier helped her onto the wagon, acutely aware of her gloved hand in his and the scent of lavender that clung to her coat. Emma immediately began chattering, telling Abigail about the books they'd been reading and how they practiced singing every night. "And James is reading chapter books now," Emma added proudly. "He's almost as good as me." "Am not," James protested, but without real annoyance, "but I can do harder sums." Xavier marveled at the change in his son, who now sat straighter and met Abigail's gaze directly as he spoke. At the ranch, Emma insisted on showing Abigail the improvements they'd made to the cabin: curtains washed and mended, shelves organized, a small collection of rocks and feathers neatly arranged on the windowsill. "We're collecting specimens," Emma explained importantly, "for natural science." "Very impressive," Abigail said, examining a hawk feather James held out for her inspection. "You have the makings of fine naturalists." Xavier busied himself preparing coffee, watching from the corner of his eye as Abigail sat with the children, listening intently to their stories and answering their eager questions about life at the fort. There was an ease to her manner that put everyone at comfort, a quality Martha had possessed as well. "Will you stay for supper, Miss James?" Emma asked hopefully. Abigail glanced at Xavier. "I wouldn't want to impose." "No imposition," he said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. "Plenty to go around," she smiled. "Then I'd be delighted." The afternoon passed pleasantly. Xavier showed Abigail the ranch while the children did their chores. She asked intelligent questions about cattle breeding and ranch management, seeming genuinely interested in his answers. "How did a Boston girl learn so much about farming?" he asked as they walked back from the corral. "My grandfather had a farm in western Massachusetts," she explained. I spent summers there as a child. It was small compared to your ranch, but I learned the value of working the land. What brought you all the way out here? Abigail's expression grew contemplative. After the war, there was so much talk of rebuilding, of new beginnings. I wanted to be part of that. And teaching positions for women are limited in the East, too much competition. Out here, I can make a real difference. Brave, leaving everything familiar behind. No braver than your wife must have been, helping you build this place from nothing. Xavier nodded, throat suddenly tight. Martha never backed down from a challenge. I wish I could have known her, Abigail said softly. Supper that evening was a livelier affair than the Grayson household had seen in years. Emma had insisted on using the good dishes, the ones that had been Martha's wedding gift from her parents. Xavier had shot a rabbit that morning, and Emma had prepared it with vegetables from their small garden. Abigail complimented the meal sincerely and even offered to help with the washing up afterward. As darkness fell, James shyly brought out the auto harp. Could we sing, Miss James, all together? That's a wonderful idea, James. Soon the cabin was filled with music. Abigail played while they all sang, even Xavier, after much coaxing from both Abigail and Emma. His deep baritone was rusty from disuse, but he remembered the words to many of the old songs his mother had taught him, songs he'd forgotten he knew. As the fire burned low in the hearth, Xavier realized he needed to get Abigail back to the fort before it grew too late. I'll hitch up the wagon, he said, rising reluctantly from his chair. Oh, but it's so dark already, Emma protested. Can't Miss James stay the night? She could have my bed and I could sleep with James. Xavier looked to Abigail, expecting her to refuse, but she seemed to be considering it. I don't want to put you out, she said, but it is quite late and I'd hate for you to have to make the trip to the fort and back in the dark. You're welcome to stay, Xavier said, ignoring the voice in his head warning him about propriety. We have the room, so it was decided. Emma cleared her belongings from her small bedroom, chattering excitedly about having their teacher stay overnight. Xavier brought in extra firewood to ensure the house would stay warm through the night, acutely aware of Abigail moving about the cabin, helping the children prepare for bed. Later, with the children asleep, Xavier and Abigail sat by the fire, cups of coffee warming their hands. Thank you for today, Xavier said quietly. It's been good for them to see you again. It's been good for me too, Abigail replied. The children at the fort are pleasant enough, but they lack the earnestness of Emma and James. You've changed them. In just those few days, you woke something in them that I thought was gone forever. Abigail's eyes reflected the firelight as she looked at him. Music has a way of reaching places words cannot. When I was a girl, my mother died of influenza. For months afterward, I couldn't bear to speak about her, but my father would play her favorite songs on the piano, and somehow that helped me remember her without the pain overwhelming me. I haven't let myself remember, Xavier admitted. Thought it would be easier to just move forward. But you carry her with you in everything you do, Abigail said gently, in how you raise your children in this home you built together. They talked long into the night, Xavier finding himself sharing stories about Martha he hadn't allowed himself to recall in years, how they'd met at a town dance, how she'd refused to marry him until he built her a proper cabin with glass windows, how she'd stood beside him through drought and blizzard, and the lean years when the cattle sickened. In return, Abigail told him about her life in Massachusetts, her education at the Mount Holyoke Female Seminary, her decision to come west despite her father's objections. He wanted me to marry a banker's son, she said with a wry smile. Can you imagine? I'd have withered away in some Boston parlor. His loss, Xavier said, surprising himself with his boldness. Kansas's gain. Morning came with pale sunlight streaming through the windows. Xavier woke to the unusual sound of laughter from the kitchen. He dressed quickly and emerged to find Abigail teaching the children how to make proper flapjacks. Good morning, Mr. Grayson, she greeted him, her hair loosely braided over one shoulder rather than in its usual severe knot. The informality of it struck him powerfully. I hope you don't mind us raiding your pantry. The children were hungry and I thought I'd make myself useful. Smells good, was all he could manage. After breakfast, Xavier offered to take Abigail back to the fort, but she surprised him by asking if she might stay a while longer. "Sundays are my free day as well," she explained. "If it wouldn't be an imposition, I'd enjoy spending more time with the children. Perhaps we could continue their music lessons." "You're welcome as long as you like," Xavier replied, perhaps too quickly. The day passed in a haze of simple pleasures. Abigail and the children sang and read together. Xavier split firewood and tended to the necessary ranch chores, always aware of Abigail's presence like a warm hearth he kept circling back to. In the afternoon, they all walked to the creek that marked the eastern boundary of the ranch. The children skipped stones across the water while Xavier and Abigail sat on a fallen log. "Will you come again?" he asked, his eyes on the children rather than her face. "When you have free time." "I'd like that," she said. "Very much." As the sun began its descent, Xavier reluctantly hitched up the wagon to take Abigail back to the fort. The children hugged her tightly, extracting promises that she would return the following Saturday. The ride to the fort was companionable, their conversation flowing more easily now. As they approached the military buildings, Abigail turned to him. "Thank you for your hospitality, Mr. Grayson." "Xavier," he said impulsively. "My friends call me Xavier," she smiled. "And mine call me Abigail." In the weeks that followed, Abigail became a regular visitor to the Grayson ranch. Each Saturday she would arrive, sometimes walking from the fort, other times accepting Xavier's offer to collect her. She would stay until Sunday evening, sleeping in Emma's room while the girl bunked with her brother. The children flourished under her attention. Emma's reading advanced rapidly, while James developed a fascination with maps and geography that Abigail encouraged by bringing him books from the fort's library. Most remarkably, both children smiled and laughed with increasing frequency, their grief no longer a constant shadow over their faces. Xavier found himself changing too. He took more care with his appearance, trimming his beard regularly and mending the worn spots on his clothes. He expanded the children's educational routine, incorporating Abigail's suggestions for practical learning, having Emma help with the accounts, and teaching James about animal husbandry. And each evening when Abigail visited, after the children were asleep, Xavier and Abigail would sit by the fire and talk. He learned about her dreams of someday starting her own school, her love of poetry, her belief in the equality of all people that had led her father to call her a dangerous radical. In turn, he shared his hopes for the ranch, his fears about raising the children alone, his memories of the border wars and the greater conflict that had followed. As Christmas approached, the weather turned bitterly cold. A heavy snow fell, making travel difficult. Xavier worried that Abigail might not be able to visit, but on the Saturday before Christmas, he hitched the horses to the sleigh and made his way carefully to Fort Hays. He found her waiting at the gates, bundled in a heavy coat and woolen scarf. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said as he helped her into the sleigh. "Promise the children," he replied, tucking a fur blanket around her legs. "And myself." The journey back to the ranch was slow, the snow-covered landscape eerily beautiful in the winter light. Abigail huddled close to him for warmth, her shoulder pressed against his arm, and Xavier found himself hyper-aware of every point of contact between them. At the ranch, the children had decorated the cabin with pine boughs and paper chains under the instruction of Mrs. Thompson, their nearest neighbor. The simple decorations transformed the plain cabin, filling it with the scent of pine and the promise of celebration. "It's lovely," Abigail said, admiring their work. "I brought something too." From her bag, she produced small packages wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Christmas gifts for everyone. The children's eyes widened. There had been no gifts the previous Christmas, Xavier too deep in grief and financial worry to consider such luxuries. "You didn't have to do that," Xavier said, embarrassed that he had nothing to offer in return. "I wanted to," Abigail replied. "Please, it gives me joy to share what I can." That evening, after a simple but hearty supper, they gathered by the fire to open Abigail's gifts. For Emma, there was a beautifully illustrated book of fairy tales. For James, a pocket compass and a small notebook for recording his observations of nature. and for Xavier, a hand-knitted scarf in deep blue wool. "I made it myself," Abigail said as he ran his fingers over the soft material. "I noticed your old one was rather threadbare." "Thank you," he said, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "I have nothing to give you in return. You've given me your hospitality and friendship," she replied. "That's gift enough." Later, after the children had gone to bed, filled with excitement for Christmas and pleased with their presents, Xavier and Abigail sat before the fire as had become their custom. The cabin was quiet save for the crackling of the flames and the occasional pop of sap from the pine boughs. "I have a confession," Xavier said after a long, comfortable silence. "I do have something for you, but I wasn't sure if it was appropriate to give it." Abigail looked at him curiously. "Oh," Xavier reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object wrapped in a handkerchief. "It's nothing fancy, not store-bought like your gifts." He handed it to her, watching nervously as she unwrapped the handkerchief to reveal a delicately carved wooden pendant on a leather cord. The pendant was in the shape of an autoharp, each tiny string etched with painstaking care. "Xavier," she breathed, running her finger over the carving. "Did you make this?" He nodded. "Been working on it in the evenings. It's not perfect, but it's beautiful," she interrupted, her eyes shining in the firelight. "Truly beautiful. Will you help me put it on?" Xavier took the necklace from her outstretched hand, his fingers clumsy with sudden nerves as Abigail turned and lifted her braid. He placed the pendant around her neck, fumbling slightly with the simple knot at the back, acutely aware of the warmth of her skin beneath his fingertips. When she turned back to face him, the wooden autoharp rested just below the hollow of her throat. "How does it look?" she asked softly. "Perfect," he said, the word emerging more hoarsely than he'd intended. Their eyes held for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. Then Abigail glanced away, her fingers touching the pendant. "I should thank you properly," she said, rising from her chair. She moved to where her bag rested beside the door and withdrew her autoharp. Returning to the fireside, she settled the instrument on her lap and began to play. The melody was unfamiliar to Xavier, but hauntingly beautiful, a slow, lilting tune that seemed to capture the stillness of the snow-covered prairie outside. And then Abigail began to sing, her clear voice filling the cabin with a song about love found in unexpected places, about second chances and hearts healing after loss. Xavier sat transfixed, watching her fingers move across the strings, her face illuminated by the firelight. In that moment, he knew with absolute certainty that he had fallen in love with Abigail James. When the song ended, the silence that followed seemed to vibrate with unspoken emotions. Abigail looked up to find Xavier watching her intently. "That was beautiful," he said quietly. "It's a new song," she replied. "I've been working on it these past few weeks." "You wrote it," she nodded, a slight flush coloring her cheeks. "Music helps me express things I might not have the courage to say otherwise." Xavier leaned forward in his chair. "What things, Abigail?" Before she could answer, a small sound from the doorway drew their attention. James stood there in his nightshirt, his hair tousled from sleep. "I heard singing," he said, rubbing his eyes. "Is it Christmas yet?" "Not yet, buddy," Xavier said, rising to scoop his son into his arms. "Just a few more days. Let's get you back to bed." The moment was broken, but as Xavier carried James back to his room, he felt a curious mix of disappointment and hope. There had been something in Abigail's eyes, in the song she'd written, that suggested his feelings might not be entirely one-sided. The next morning brought more snow, heavy flakes drifting down from a leaden sky. After breakfast, Xavier checked the road and returned with grim news. "Trail to the fort's completely drifted over," he told Abigail. "Won't be safe to travel until it lets up and I can clear a path." "Oh dear," Abigail said, though she didn't look particularly distressed. "Will I be imposing if I stay an extra day or two?" "You're always welcome here," Xavier assured her, "for as long as you need." The children were delighted by the news, immediately planning activities to entertain their teacher during her extended stay. Emma wanted to bake Christmas cookies, while James suggested building a snow fort once the storm abated. The day passed in cozy domesticity. Xavier marveled at how naturally Abigail fit into their home, as if she'd always been a part of it. She helped Emma with the cookie dough, showing her how to measure the flour precisely and how to tell when the cookies were perfectly baked. She assisted James in drawing elaborate plans for his snow fort, suggesting defensive strategies that made the boy giggle with delight. And throughout the day, Xavier found reasons to be near her, passing her ingredients in the kitchen, stoking the fire when she mentioned feeling chilled, sitting beside her at the table as they all played a card game James had recently learned. That night, after the children were asleep, Xavier added extra logs to the fire and poured 2 cups of the cherry cordial Mrs. Thompson had gifted them for the holidays. "To being snowbound with good company," he said, raising his cup to Abigail. She smiled, touching her cup to his. "Indeed. Though I should probably be concerned about my reputation, staying unchaperoned in a widower's home." "Hayes City's a good 40 miles from Boston," Xavier reminded her. "Frontier has different rules." "True enough. Still, if Mrs. Palmer knew." She chuckled, sipping the sweet cordial. "Would it bother you if people talked?" Abigail considered this, her expression thoughtful. "It might affect my position at the fort. The colonel's wife is rather particular about proprieties. But no, personally, it wouldn't trouble me. I've never put much stock in society's arbitrary rules." "That's what I admire about you," Xavier said, emboldened by the cordial and the intimacy of the firelit cabin. "You make your own way, regardless of what others think." "Not always," Abigail admitted. "I conformed for many years, trying to be the proper Boston lady my father wanted. It wasn't until after the war, when so many of our certainties had been shattered, that I found the courage to chart my own course." "What made you choose teaching?" "And the West." She twirled the cup between her palms, watching the firelight play through the amber liquid. "I've always loved learning and sharing knowledge. As for the West, I read accounts of pioneer women, of the freedom they found despite the hardships. I wanted that freedom." "And have you found it?" "I'm finding it," she replied, meeting his eyes, "day by day." They talked long into the night, the cordial and the fire warming them as the storm raged outside. Xavier found himself sharing hopes and dreams he'd rarely voiced aloud, his plans to expand the ranch, his desire to give his children opportunities he'd never had, his secret wish to someday see the ocean. "You should," Abigail said earnestly. "The Atlantic in summer is glorious. The way the light plays on the water at sunset, there's nothing like it." "Maybe someday," Xavier said, though he couldn't imagine leaving the prairie that had always been his home. "Why not? The railroad goes all the way to Boston now. You could take the children. They should see more of the world than just Kansas. Would you show us around? If we came to Boston," Abigail's smile was warm, "I'd be delighted to, though I don't know how long I'll be at the fort. My contract is only for a year." "What then?" Xavier asked, trying to keep his tone casual despite the sudden tightness in his chest at the thought of her leaving Kansas. "I'm not sure yet. I've had some correspondence with a women's college in Missouri that's expanding its teacher training program. They're interested in my experience." "Missouri," Xavier repeated. "That's closer than Boston, at least." Abigail studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "Yes, it is, though Hayes City has its appeal too." The storm continued through the night and into the next day. The children were restless, so Xavier and Abigail devised games to keep them occupied: charades and storytelling contests, and a treasure hunt that sent them searching through the cabin for clues Abigail had cleverly hidden. By the afternoon of Christmas Eve, the snow had finally stopped. Xavier spent several hours clearing a path to the barn and feeding the cattle, which had huddled together in the shelter of the corral during the worst of the storm. When he returned to the cabin, stomping snow from his boots, he found Abigail and the children decorating the small pine tree James had insisted on bringing inside before the storm. They had strung popcorn and cranberries and hung the paper chains from the branches. On the very top, Abigail had fashioned a star from tin foil that caught the light and sparkled. "What do you think, Pa?" Emma asked eagerly. "Isn't it the prettiest tree you ever saw?" "It surely is," Xavier agreed, his throat tight with emotion. There had been no Christmas tree the previous year, no celebration at all. The contrast between that bleak time and the warmth filling the cabin now was stark. That evening, they prepared a simple feast together: roast chicken, potatoes, and the special cranberry sauce Abigail had brought from the fort. As they sat down to eat, Xavier found himself offering a prayer of thanks, something he hadn't done since Martha's death. "For food, for shelter, for health," he said, his eyes closed and his children's small hands in his. "And for new friends who bring music and laughter back into our lives. Amen, amen," chorused the others. After dinner, Abigail suggested they follow a tradition from her childhood. On Christmas Eve, we would gather around the fire and each tell a story, something that happened during the year that we were grateful for. Emma went first, describing the day Abigail had first come to teach them and how she had felt when she heard the auto harp for the first time. James spoke quietly but clearly about finding a fox den in the spring and watching the kits play while their mother hunted nearby. Xavier's turn came. He hesitated, then spoke from the heart. "I'm grateful for the day Samuel Hollister told me about a teacher who'd come to town. I almost didn't go to meet her, almost convinced myself the children were doing fine without more schooling, but something made me walk to Mrs. Palmer's that day and it changed everything." When he finished, he found Abigail watching him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "And you, Miss James?" Emma prompted. "What are you grateful for?" Abigail touched the wooden pendant at her throat. "I'm grateful for second chances," she said softly. "For finding that life can surprise you when you least expect it, and that joy can follow sorrow as surely as spring follows winter." Later, after the children had been tucked into bed with promises that Santa would indeed find them despite the snow, Xavier and Abigail sat by the fire one last time before she was to return to the fort the next day. "I have something else for you," Xavier said, reaching into his pocket. "Found it in town last month, but wasn't sure if I should give it to you." He handed her a small package wrapped in plain paper. Abigail unwrapped it carefully to reveal a small book of poetry, Emily Dickinson's verses, recently published. "Oh, Xavier," she breathed, running her fingers over the embossed cover. "How did you know? She's my favorite poet." "You mentioned her that first night we really talked," he said, pleased by her reaction. "Remembered because my mother was fond of poetry too." Abigail opened the book, turning the pages reverently. "This is the most thoughtful gift I've ever received." "There's something else," Xavier said, his heart pounding in his chest. "Something I need to say before you go back to the fort tomorrow." She closed the book, giving him her full attention. "Yes, these past months, having you here with us, it's been like watching the prairie come back to life after a long drought. The children smile again. They laugh and sing and look forward to tomorrow, and I." He paused, gathering his courage. "I've found myself looking forward to tomorrows too, because of you." Abigail set the book aside and leaned toward him. "Xavier, let me finish," he said gently. "I know we come from different worlds. You're educated, cultured. I'm just a rancher who's barely keeping afloat, but I care for you, Abigail, more than I thought I could ever care for anyone after Martha, and if there's any chance you might feel something similar." "I do," she said simply, her eyes never leaving his. "I've tried to tell myself it's foolish that I came west to be independent, not to lose my heart to a Kansas rancher and his children, but the heart doesn't always listen to reason." Xavier reached across the space between them to take her hand. "I'm not asking for promises, just possibilities." "Possibilities?" Abigail repeated, her fingers intertwining with his. "I like the sound of that." Outside, the night was still and clear, the storm having swept the sky clean of clouds. Stars glittered against the blackness, and a nearly full moon cast silver light across the snow-covered prairie. Inside the cabin, a man and woman sat by the dying fire, hands clasped, speaking quietly of hopes and dreams and the unexpected paths that had brought them together. Christmas morning dawned bright and cold. The children woke early, excited to discover that despite the storm, small gifts had appeared beneath their tree, wooden toys Xavier had carved in secret moments. Sweets from the fort that Abigail had tucked into her bag, warm mittens Mrs. Thompson had knitted for them. After breakfast, Xavier hitched the horses to the sleigh for the journey back to Fort Hays. The children hugged Abigail tightly, extracting promises that she would return as soon as possible. "Will you be back for New Year's?" Emma asked hopefully. "If the weather permits," Abigail promised. "And if your father is willing to make the journey again." "Always." Xavier said simply. The ride to the fort was magical, the vast expanse of prairie transformed into a glittering wonderland, the runners of the sleigh cutting smooth tracks through the pristine snow. Abigail sat close beside Xavier, sharing the warmth of the fur blanket and the unspoken anticipation of what might lie ahead for them. At the gates of Fort Hays, Xavier helped Abigail down from the sleigh. Before she could turn to go, he caught her hand. "Abigail," he said quietly. "I meant what I said last night. Whatever happens, whatever you decide about Missouri or anywhere else, these have been the best months since I lost Martha. I won't forget them." She looked up at him, her eyes clear and certain. "I meant what I said too, Xavier, and I'm not going anywhere just yet. We have time to explore those possibilities." Then, with a quick glance at the distant sentry, she stood on tiptoe and pressed a swift kiss to Xavier's cheek. "Merry Christmas," she whispered, then turned and hurried through the gates. Xavier stood for a long moment, his hand touching the spot where her lips had brushed his skin, before finally turning the sleigh toward home. As he drove, he found himself whistling one of the tunes Abigail had taught the children, his heart lighter than it had been in years. The weeks that followed were the happiest the Grayson household had known since Martha's death. True to her word, Abigail returned for New Year's Eve, bringing with her a bottle of sparkling cider to toast the coming year. The children were allowed to stay up until midnight, a rare treat that had them buzzing with excitement. As the old year drew to a close, the four of them stood on the porch, bundled against the cold, watching the stars wheel overhead in the vast Kansas sky. In Boston, Abigail told them, there would be fireworks and church bells ringing. "I like this better," Emma decided, nestled against Abigail's side. "Just us and the stars." When the pocket watch Xavier carried showed midnight, they clinked their cups together and drank the sweet cider. Then Abigail began to sing Auld Lang Syne, her voice rising clear and true in the stillness. One by one, the others joined in, Emma first, then James, and finally Xavier, his deep baritone providing a foundation for their improvised harmony. The song ended, and in the silence that followed, Xavier found himself meeting Abigail's eyes across the tops of the children's heads. Something passed between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of feelings too new and precious to name, but growing stronger with each passing day. January brought bitter cold and more snow, but Xavier found reasons to ride into Hays City more frequently than usual, often continuing on to the fort to visit Abigail. Sometimes they would walk together along the parade ground, bundled against the wind, talking of books and music and the children's progress. Other times, when the weather was too harsh for walking, they would sit in the small officers' lounge where Abigail was permitted to receive visitors, their conversation limited by the presence of others, but their eyes conveying what words could not. On one such visit in late January, Xavier found Abigail waiting for him with news. "The colonel's wife has invited me to start a small choir among the children," she told him excitedly. "We'll perform for the officers and their families. Would Emma and James like to participate?" "I know it's a long way to come for rehearsals, but they'd love it," Xavier interrupted, "and I don't mind the drive." And so, twice a week, Xavier would bundle the children into the sleigh and drive to Fort Hays, where they would join the handful of officers' children in singing lessons led by Abigail. Afterward, they would often stay for supper in the officers' mess, a treat the children looked forward to eagerly. It was during these regular visits that Xavier began to notice a change in how Abigail was treated by some at the fort. The colonel's wife, a formidable woman named Mrs. Harrington, watched with narrowed eyes whenever Xavier and Abigail spoke together. Several of the younger officers who had previously shown interest in the attractive teacher now kept their distance, as if some invisible boundary had been established. "People are talking, aren't they?" Xavier asked Abigail one evening as he prepared to leave with the children. She sighed. "Mrs. Harrington has made some pointed remarks about the propriety of my friendship with you, nothing direct, but her meaning was clear enough. I'm sorry, don't want to cause trouble for you." Abigail's expression was resolute. "You have nothing to apologize for. Besides, I've never been one to let gossip dictate my choices." Despite her brave words, Xavier worried. Abigail's position at the fort depended on the good opinion of the colonel and his wife. If they decided her friendship with a widowed rancher was inappropriate, she could find herself without employment in a place where options for a single woman were limited. These concerns were still weighing on his mind a week later when he arrived at the fort for the children's choir rehearsal, only to be met by a stone-faced sentry who informed him that Miss James had requested the Grayson children not attend that day. "Is Miss James ill?" Xavier asked, immediately concerned. "Don't know, sir. Just following orders." Confused and increasingly worried, Xavier left the children with Mrs. Thompson and rode back to the fort alone, determined to discover what had happened. This time, he was directed not to the officers' lounge but to Abigail's small quarters in the teacher's building. He found her packing her belongings into a trunk, her normally neat hair disheveled, and her eyes reddened from what appeared to be recent tears. "Abigail, what's happened?" She looked up, startled by his arrival. "Xavier, how did you never mind? You shouldn't be here. The sentry said you'd canceled the children's lesson. Are you ill?" "No, I'm perfectly well." She resumed folding a dress and placing it carefully in the trunk. "But I've been relieved of my position, effective immediately." "What? Why?" Abigail's hands stilled on the fabric. "Mrs. Harrington found the poetry book you gave me. Inside was the note you wrote." She trailed off, color rising in her cheeks. Xavier remembered the inscription he'd penned on the flyleaf. "To Abigail, who brought music back to our home and light back to my heart." "Hardly scandalous," he said, anger beginning to simmer beneath his concern. "No, but combined with our regular visits and what Mrs. Harrington calls my overfamiliarity with your family, it was enough. She convinced the colonel that I was setting a poor example for the other young ladies at the fort. That's ridiculous. We've done nothing improper. By Boston standards, perhaps not. But frontier military posts operate on their own particular code of conduct, and apparently I've transgressed." Abigail attempted a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It's not entirely unexpected. I've been receiving rather chilly receptions from the officers' wives for weeks now." Xavier ran a hand through his hair, frustration and guilt warring within him. "This is my fault. I should have been more careful." "No," Abigail said firmly, crossing the room to stand before him. "I made my choices with open eyes, and I don't regret them. What will you do now?" "I've been considering that offer from Missouri. The women's college would welcome me immediately, from what I understand." The thought of Abigail leaving Kansas sent a cold spike of dread through Xavier's chest. "When would you go?" "As soon as the weather permits travel." "The stage should be running regularly by March." She turned back to her packing, her movements more brisk than before. "Abigail," Xavier said, his voice rough with emotion. "Don't go." She paused but didn't turn around. "I have to go somewhere, Xavier. I can't stay at the fort, and there are no teaching positions available in Hays City. Stay with us." The words came out before he could consider them fully, but once spoken, he knew they were right. "The children need you, I need you." Now she did turn, her expression a complex mixture of hope and uncertainty. "Xavier, you can't mean marry me," he said, crossing the distance between them in 2 strides and taking her hands in his. "I know it's sudden, I know we come from different worlds. But these past months have shown me that some differences don't matter when 2 people share what truly counts." Abigail's eyes widened. "You're asking me to be your wife, to help raise Emma and James." "Yes to both. I love you, Abigail. I think I've loved you since that first day you sang by our fire and made my children smile again." Tears welled in her eyes, but these were different from the ones she'd shed earlier. "I love you too, Xavier, but marriage, it's such a permanent step. More permanent than moving to Missouri." He asked gently. She gave a watery laugh. "Fair point." Xavier released her hands to cup her face tenderly. "I'm not asking for an answer this minute. Just promise you'll consider it before you decide to leave." "I promise," she whispered. 2 days later, Xavier returned to the fort to find Abigail waiting for him with her trunk and belongings. Mrs. Palmer had refused to rent her a room at the boarding house, claiming all spaces were occupied, though Abigail knew this to be untrue. "Seems my reputation has preceded me," she said wryly as Xavier loaded her trunk onto his wagon. "Mrs. Thompson has offered you a place to stay," Xavier told her, "at least until you decide. What comes next? Mrs. Thompson, a widow herself who lived a mile from the Grayson ranch, welcomed Abigail warmly. "Don't you pay any mind to those Fort folks," she advised as she showed Abigail to the small bedroom that had once belonged to her daughter. "Acting high and mighty while half the officers carouse in town every payday. Hypocrites, the lot of them." With Abigail living so close by, a new routine quickly developed. She spent her days with the Grayson children, continuing their education more formally now that she had no other pupils. In the evenings, she would return to Mrs. Thompson's, though she often stayed at the Grayson ranch for supper, filling the cabin with music and laughter before Xavier walked her home across the starlit prairie. Throughout February, as winter maintained its grip on the Kansas plains, Xavier and Abigail grew closer. Their conversations deepened, touching on hopes and fears, past regrets and future dreams. Xavier shared more about his life with Martha and his devastating grief after her death. Abigail spoke of her ambivalent relationship with her father and her determination to forge her own path despite his disapproval. And always, there was the unspoken question of what would happen when spring came and the roads cleared for travel. March arrived with warming winds and the first tentative signs of green emerging from beneath the snow. One evening, as Xavier walked Abigail back to Mrs. Thompson's after supper, she broached the subject they'd both been carefully avoiding. "I received a letter yesterday," she said. "From the college in Missouri. They're still interested in having me join their faculty in April." Xavier's heart sank, but he kept his voice level. "I see. I need to give them an answer soon." They walked in silence for several moments, the only sounds the squelch of mud beneath their boots and the distant call of a night bird. "Have you decided?" Xavier finally asked. Abigail stopped walking, turning to face him in the silver light of the rising moon. "I have. But before I tell you my decision, I need to ask you something important." "Anything? Your proposal, was it made in haste, to prevent me from leaving, or is it truly what you want?" Xavier took both her hands in his. "Abigail James, I have thought of little else since that day. I want you as my wife, as a mother to my children, as my partner in whatever life brings us. Not to keep you from Missouri, but because I cannot imagine my future without you in it." A smile bloomed across her face, radiant even in the moonlight. "Then my answer is yes. To you and to the children, and to this life we'll build together." Joy surged through Xavier, so powerful it nearly drove him to his knees. Instead, he pulled Abigail into his arms and kissed her their first real kiss, tender and sweet and full of promise. When they parted, both breathless, Abigail laughed softly. "Mrs. Thompson is probably watching from the window, you know." "Let her," Xavier said, unrepentant. "Soon enough we won't need to say good night at her door." The news of their engagement spread quickly through Hays City, generating reactions that ranged from genuine congratulations to thinly veiled disapproval. Xavier paid little heed to the gossips, his focus entirely on preparing for the wedding and the future beyond. Emma and James received the news with unbridled enthusiasm. Emma immediately began making plans to redecorate the cabin, while James solemnly asked Abigail if he could still call her Miss James sometimes, since that's how I first knew you. "Of course," Abigail assured him. "You can call me whatever feels right to you." They were married on a perfect spring day in late March, with wildflowers just beginning to dot the prairie. The ceremony took place in the small church in Hays City, with Mrs. Thompson, Samuel Hollister, and a handful of neighboring ranchers in attendance. The colonel's wife and the other Fort ladies were conspicuously absent, though two of the younger officers and their wives did attend, quietly defying the social embargo. Emma served as Abigail's bridesmaid, proudly holding a bouquet of early prairie flowers. James stood beside his father, solemn in his Sunday best, the rings secured carefully in his pocket until the moment they were needed. Abigail wore a simple dress of pale blue, silk, her one concession to Boston fashion, with her chestnut hair arranged in soft curls beneath a modest veil. When Xavier saw her walking toward him down the short aisle, his heart seemed to stop, then race ahead, filled with a joy he had never expected to feel again. The vows were simple and heartfelt. Xavier's voice was steady as he promised to love and cherish Abigail for all his days. Her eyes shone with happy tears as she pledged herself to him, and to the children who would now be hers as well. As they emerged from the church as husband and wife, the spring sunshine bathed them in golden light, and Xavier was struck by the strange, winding path that had brought them to this moment, a path that had begun in grief but led, improbably, to new happiness. The wedding supper was held at the ranch, with trestle tables set up in the yard and lanterns hanging from the trees. Mrs. Thompson and several neighbor women had prepared a feast, and Samuel Hollister had donated a barrel of cider for the celebration. As the sun began to set, Abigail took out her autoharp and began to play. The music drew everyone together around the fire that had been built in the yard. Abigail sang the song she had written for Xavier at Christmas, and then other songs that had the children and even some of the adults joining in. The melodies rose into the darkening sky, carrying with them the joy of the day and the promise of the days to come. Later, after the guests had departed and the children had been tucked into bed at Mrs. Thompson's for the night, Xavier and Abigail stood together on the porch of what was now their home. "Happy?" Xavier asked, his arm around his wife's waist. "Completely," she replied, leaning into him. "Though I'm a little nervous about tomorrow. Tomorrow, when the children come home, when I truly become their mother." Abigail's voice held a touch of uncertainty. "I want so much to be what they need." Xavier turned her to face him. "You already are what they need, what we all need. You brought music back into our lives when there was only silence. You taught the children to smile again and me to hope again." Abigail reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the lines around his eyes that crinkled when he smiled, lines that had been deepened by grief but now were softened by joy. "And you," she said softly, "gave me a home when I was adrift and a family when I was alone. I never expected to find such happiness here on the Kansas prairie." "Nor I," Xavier admitted, after losing Martha, "thought that part of my life was over for good." "Life has a way of surprising us," Abigail said, raising her face to his, "and I, for one, am grateful for its surprises." As spring yielded to summer, the Grayson Ranch flourished under the combined efforts of its expanded family. Xavier's cattle herd grew, bolstered by a successful calving season and favorable market prices. The vegetable garden Abigail and Emma tended yielded bountifully. Even the cabin itself seemed transformed, brightened by Abigail's deft touches, fresh curtains, colorful quilts, and wildflowers in mason jars on every available surface. But the most remarkable transformation was in the children. Emma blossomed under Abigail's guidance, developing not only academically but also in confidence and creativity. She took to playing the autoharp with natural talent, often accompanying Abigail's singing in the evenings. James, too, emerged from his shell of grief. His interest in nature developed into a passion, encouraged by Abigail, who taught him to keep careful records of his observations in the notebook she had given him for Christmas. His smile, once so rare, became a common sight around the ranch. One evening in late summer, as the family sat on the porch after supper, Xavier looked around at his wife and children and felt a contentment so deep it almost brought tears to his eyes. Emma was teaching James a new song on the autoharp, their heads bent close together over the instrument. Abigail sat beside Xavier, her hand in his, a book of poetry open on her lap. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, noticing his contemplative expression. "Just thinking how lucky I am," he replied. "How lucky we all are." Abigail squeezed his hand. "Indeed we are." That night, after the children were asleep, Xavier and Abigail sat by the fire as they had so many times before, but now as husband and wife rather than friends, cautiously exploring their feelings. "I've been thinking," Abigail said, setting aside her mending, "about expanding the children's education." Xavier raised an eyebrow. "They're already ahead of most children their age, thanks to you." "Yes, but there are limits to what I can teach them alone. I was considering starting a small school, perhaps in that old cabin on the Thompson property." Mrs. Thompson mentioned it's been empty since her son moved to California. Xavier considered this. "Would be good for other children in the area too. Nearest school's in Hays City, too far for daily travel." Exactly my thinking. I could teach during the day and still be home for supper and evenings with the family. If it's what you want, I support you completely. Abigail smiled, her eyes reflecting the firelight. It is. I love teaching, Xavier. And this way, I can continue my profession while still being fully present for our family. Our family, Xavier repeated, savoring the words. Never thought I'd hear myself say that again after Martha died. Life does go on, Abigail said gently. Martha will always be part of your past, part of who you are, but we're building something new together, something that honors her memory while looking toward the future. Xavier pulled his wife into his arms, overwhelmed by the wisdom and compassion of the woman he'd married. I love you, Abigail Grayson. And I love you, Xavier Grayson, every day more than the day before. As autumn painted the prairie in gold and crimson, Abigail's small school became a reality. The Thompson cabin was repaired and furnished with simple desks and a blackboard. 6 children from neighboring ranches joined Emma and James for daily lessons, their eager faces turning to Abigail each morning as she opened the world of knowledge to them. Xavier often found excuses to ride past the schoolhouse during the day, just to hear the sound of children's voices reciting lessons or singing the songs Abigail taught them. The sight of his wife standing before her pupils, her face animated as she explained some concept or praised a correct answer, filled him with pride and gratitude. In November, as the first snows threatened and the cattle were brought closer to the ranch for the winter, Abigail shared news that completed their happiness. She was expecting a child, due in the late spring. The children received the news with excitement, Emma immediately beginning to plan a layette, while James solemnly promised to teach his new sibling everything he knew about the prairie wildlife. That winter was unlike any the Grayson ranch had known before. Though the snows came heavy and the wind blew fierce across the plains, the cabin was warm with love and laughter. Each evening, Abigail would play the auto harp while the family sang together, their voices rising in harmony as the fire crackled in the hearth. On Christmas Eve, 1 year after Xavier had first acknowledged his feelings for Abigail, they gathered once more around the fire to share stories of gratitude. I'm grateful for my new brother or sister, Emma said, placing a gentle hand on Abigail's slightly rounded middle. And for Mother teaching me to play the auto harp. Mother was still a new term, one Emma used carefully and with reverence, though it had become more natural over the months since the wedding. I'm grateful for my notebook, James said, holding up the well-worn journal now filled with his careful observations and drawings. And for Father teaching me to track animals in the snow. Xavier went next. I'm grateful for this family, for the love we share, and for second chances at happiness. Abigail, her eyes bright with unshed tears, completed the circle. I'm grateful for music which brought me to this family and for the new life we're creating together. Then, as they had the year before, they sang Silent Night together, their voices blending in the quiet cabin while outside, the vast Kansas sky spread above the snow-covered prairie, stars glittering like diamonds against the velvet darkness. In late May, as wildflowers once again carpeted the prairie and new calves frolicked in the pastures, Abigail gave birth to a son they named William Thomas Grayson. Emma and James adored their little brother instantly, vying for opportunities to hold him and sing to him the lullabies Abigail had taught them. On a perfect June evening, with the baby sleeping peacefully in his cradle, the family gathered on the porch to watch the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and pink. Abigail's auto harp rested on her lap, her fingers moving across the strings in a melody that seemed to capture the beauty of the moment. Then, as twilight deepened and the first stars appeared, she began to sing a song of love found and joy restored, of grief transcended and hope renewed. Emma and James joined in, their young voices twining with their mothers in perfect harmony. Xavier, watching them, felt his heart swell with a happiness so complete it seemed almost too much to bear. 2 years ago, he had stood at the darkest crossroads of his life, uncertain if he could continue without Martha, if he could raise their children alone, if the ranch would survive the challenges it faced. Now, as his wife's voice rose clear and sweet in the gathering dusk, and his children's faces shone with contentment, he knew with absolute certainty that life's journey, however difficult, could lead to unexpected blessings. That grief, however profound, could be followed by joy. That a single song, sung beside a prairie fire, could change everything. As the last notes of the music faded into the vast Kansas night, Abigail looked up and met his gaze, her eyes filled with all the love and promise that had transformed their lives. Xavier reached for her hand, finding in its warmth the fulfillment of a promise he had once thought forever lost, the promise of home, of family, of love that endures beyond all expectation. And in that moment, under the endless prairie sky, their story begun in sorrow but rewritten in joy felt as vast and hopeful as the frontier itself, stretching before them with infinite possibility.